The scratching came first. Not the soft rustle of a branch against the window, not the familiar creak of the cabin settling in the cold. This was something else entirely. Heavy, desperate, deliberate. I set down my coffee and listened. The sound came again, harder this time. Claws against wood, dragging downward, like a final plea carved into the door itself. In 15 years as a ranger in the Montana wilderness, I had heard many sounds that made my blood run cold. The scream of a mountain lion, the crack of thin ice beneath my boots, the distant roar of wildfire racing through dry timber. But I had never heard anything like this. I reached for my flashlight and moved toward the door. Through the small window, I could see the orange glow of the fires still burning on the distant ridge, painting the night sky in apocalyptic shades. The smoke had been thick for days, turning the sun into a bleeding wound each morning. And standing there, barely visible through the haze, was a shape that made my heart stop. A grizzly bear. Not just any grizzly, a mother. I could tell by her size, by the protective curve of her massive body. She was pressed against my door, her head lowered, her breath coming in ragged, visible clouds. But what she carried in her mouth, what hung limp and motionless from her jaws, that's when I understood. She wasn't here to hunt. She was here to beg. My name is Daniel Mercer. I've been a wildlife ranger in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem for 15 years, working out of a remote station near the northern boundary, where Montana bleeds into wilderness so vast that a man could walk for weeks without seeing another soul. I've tracked wolves through blizzards. I've relocated problem bears. I've pulled hikers from crevasses and held the hands of people who wouldn't make it to the helicopter. This job has shown me every face of nature, its beauty, its brutality, its complete indifference to human plans. But nothing had prepared me for that summer. The fire started in late July, a lightning strike in the Absaroka Range, they said, though it hardly mattered anymore. What mattered was that the fire didn't stop. It ate through thousands of acres of dry timber, driven by winds that seemed to shift every hour, always finding new fuel, new territory to consume. By August, the sky hadn't been blue in 3 weeks. The evacuation orders came fast. My partner, James, had been airlifted out 4 days earlier, a burst appendix of all things, in the middle of the worst fire season in decades. The replacement crew was supposed to arrive the next morning, but the smoke had grounded all flights. I was alone. The station had enough supplies for 2 people for 2 weeks. I had been rationing carefully, not knowing when the smoke would clear, when the helicopters could fly again. The radio worked intermittently. The fire had taken out a repeater tower somewhere, and communications were spotty at best. That night, when the scratching started, I had been monitoring the fire's progression on the topographic maps spread across my desk. The western ridge was fully engulfed. The eastern valley was next. Between them, somewhere in that hellscape of flame and smoke, was some of the richest grizzly habitat in the lower 48 states. I had been thinking about the bears all week. Where would they go? How many would survive? The fire was moving faster than any animal could run, and the smoke alone could kill. Now, standing at my door with a flashlight in my trembling hand, I was about to find out. I opened the door slowly. The grizzly didn't charge. She didn't rear up. She didn't even growl. She simply stood there, swaying slightly, her massive body trembling with exhaustion. Her fur, normally a rich brown with silver-tipped guard hairs, was singed black in patches. Her paws were cracked and bleeding. Her eyes, those deep, intelligent eyes that I had seen in countless bears over the years, held something I had never witnessed before. Desperation. In her mouth, held with impossible gentleness, was a cub. The cub couldn't have been more than 5 months old. Its small body hung limp, its eyes closed, its fur matted with soot and something darker. Blood, I realized. Burns covered its front paws and muzzle. Its breathing was so shallow, I had to look twice to confirm it was breathing at all. The mother grizzly took one step toward me. Every instinct I had screamed at me to back away. A protective mother grizzly is the most dangerous animal in North America. They have killed hunters, hikers, researchers, anyone perceived as a threat to their cubs. A single swipe of those massive paws could end my life in a heartbeat. But she didn't attack. Instead, she did something I will never forget as long as I live. She lowered her head and gently, so gently, placed the cub at my feet. Then she looked up at me, not with aggression, not with fear, with trust. I stood frozen, my mind racing. This shouldn't be happening. This defied everything I knew about grizzly behavior, about the iron wall between wild animals and humans, about the instincts that had kept her species alive for millennia. But here she was, this magnificent, wounded creature, offering me her dying child, because she had nowhere else to turn. The cub let out a small whimper, barely audible, barely alive, and I made my decision. I stepped aside and gestured toward the warmth of the station. "Come in," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Both of you, come in." The mother grizzly didn't hesitate. She picked up her cub with that same heartbreaking tenderness and walked past me into the station. She moved slowly, painfully, each step clearly costing her tremendous effort. Once inside, she collapsed onto the floor near the wood stove, her massive body shuddering with relief as the warmth enveloped her. I closed the door against the smoke-filled night and knelt beside them, my mind already working through what I knew, what I could guess, and what I might never understand. I recognized this bear. We had been monitoring the local grizzly population for years, tracking their movements, documenting their health. This female was one of our regulars. We called her Shadow because of the way she seemed to appear and disappear in the forest like a ghost. 3 weeks earlier, during a routine patrol, I had seen her near the eastern ridge, healthy and strong, with 2 cubs tumbling around her feet. 2 cubs. Now there was only 1. As I examined the surviving cub, careful not to move too quickly, not to startle the mother who watched my every move, I began to piece together what must have happened. The fire had come faster than anyone predicted. It swept down from the western ridge in the middle of the night, a wall of flame driven by winds that changed direction without warning. Shadow would have been in her den with her cubs, perhaps already preparing for the long sleep of hibernation, her body fat from a summer of hunting and foraging. The first sign would have been the smell, then the smoke, seeping into the den, burning her eyes and throat. Then the heat, rising so fast that the air itself became painful to breathe. She would have grabbed one cub first. Instinct, pure instinct, and run. But the fire was everywhere. I imagined her standing at the edge of an inferno, one cub in her mouth, looking back at the den where her second baby screamed in terror. The flames between them, growing higher, growing hotter. No path back, no way through. She had to choose. She had to leave one behind. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I looked at the mother grizzly, at the way her eyes had closed, at the tremor that ran through her singed fur, and I understood something about grief that transcended species. She was a mother who had lost a child, and she had carried the survivor for miles, through smoke that would have blinded her, over terrain that would have shredded her paws, across rivers swollen with ash and debris. until she found the one place where she thought her remaining baby might have a chance. A human's door. The enemy of her species. The last hope for her cub. The cub was dying. I could see it in the shallow rise and fall of its small chest, in the blue tinge around its muzzle, and the way its body had gone completely limp. The burns on its paws were severe, second degree at least, possibly worse. Its breathing was labored, its heartbeat erratic when I gently pressed my fingers against its throat. I had basic veterinary training. Every ranger does. We learn to treat injured wildlife, to stabilize animals for transport, to recognize when an animal is beyond saving. This cub was balanced on the edge. I moved quickly to the supply cabinet, pulling out everything I had. Sterile gauze, burn cream, saline solution, oxygen from the emergency medical kit. It wasn't much. This station wasn't equipped for intensive animal care, but it was all I had. The mother watched me the entire time. She didn't move from her spot by the stove, but her eyes tracked my every movement with an intensity that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. One wrong move, one sign of threat to her cub, and those massive jaws could crush my skull before I even had time to scream. But she didn't attack. She watched. She waited. She trusted. I knelt beside the cub and began to work. First, the airways. I cleared the soot and debris from its nose and mouth, using a small suction device to remove the mucus that had built up in its throat. The cub coughed weakly. A good sign, I told myself. Coughing meant fighting. Coughing meant life. Next, the burns. I cleaned the wounds as gently as I could, applying burn cream and wrapping the tiny paws in sterile gauze. The cub whimpered throughout, small sounds of pain that broke my heart. But it didn't struggle. It didn't have the strength. The mother grizzly made a low sound, not a growl, something softer, a sound of concern, of encouragement. I looked at her. "I'm trying," I said quietly. "I'm trying to save your baby." She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she lowered her massive head and rested it on her paws, still watching, still waiting. The hours blurred together. I monitored the cub's breathing, adjusting the oxygen flow, keeping it warm with heated blankets from the emergency supplies. I fed it small amounts of water mixed with electrolytes, using a syringe to drip the liquid into its mouth. Somewhere around midnight, the cub's breathing steadied. Its heartbeat grew stronger. Around 3 a.m, it opened its eyes. They were dark and confused, those tiny eyes, blinking against the light of the cabin. The cub looked around, clearly disoriented, clearly frightened. Then its gaze found its mother, and it let out a small, plaintive cry. The mother grizzly lifted her head immediately. She made a sound I had never heard before, a deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, a sound of comfort, of reassurance. "I'm here. I'm here. You're safe." The cub began to crawl toward her, its bandaged paws sliding on the wooden floor, its small body trembling with effort. I watched, not daring to breathe, as it crossed the impossible distance between us. When it reached its mother, she curled her massive body around it, creating a protective cave of singed fur and exhausted flesh. The cub burrowed into her warmth, found her belly, and began to nurse. The sound that came from its tiny mouth, that satisfied, desperate suckling, was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I sat back against the wall, suddenly aware of how tired I was, how much my hands were shaking. Outside, the fire still burned. The smoke still choked the sky. The world was still ending. But in this small cabin, a mother was feeding her baby. And for now, that was enough. The next 3 days existed outside of normal time. The mother grizzly, Shadow, showed no interest in leaving. She seemed to understand, on some level I couldn't explain, that this cabin was sanctuary, that I was not a threat, that her cub needed time to heal. I fell into a routine. Each morning, I would check the cub's bandages, cleaning and redressing the burns that were slowly, miraculously beginning to heal. The mother would watch these examinations with that same intense focus, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed almost like encouragement. She never tried to stop me. She never showed aggression. It was as if we had formed an unspoken agreement. I would care for her baby, and she would trust me to do it. On the second day, I faced a choice. My food supplies were running critically low. The smoke still grounded all aircraft, and the fire had cut off the only road to the station. I had enough for myself to last maybe 4 more days, if I rationed carefully. But the mother grizzly was starving. I could see it in her sunken flanks, in the way her ribs had become visible beneath her damaged fur. She hadn't eaten since arriving. She had been too focused on her cub, too exhausted to hunt. Without food, she wouldn't be able to produce milk. Without milk, the cub wouldn't survive. I looked at my supplies: 3 cans of emergency rations, a package of dried fish, some crackers, and peanut butter. Then I looked at the cub, sleeping peacefully against its mother's belly. There was no choice, really. I gave her the fish. She ate slowly at first, almost cautiously, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. Then faster, with growing strength, until the fish was gone and she was licking the floor where it had been. I gave her the second fish an hour later, and the third that evening. By the 3rd day, I was down to crackers and peanut butter, but the mother was producing milk again. The cub was nursing regularly, its small body growing stronger by the hour. Its eyes had lost that glazed, distant look. Its cries had become louder, more demanding. It was going to live. On the morning of the 4th day, something changed. The cub stood up. It was wobbly, uncertain, its bandaged paws slipping on the wooden floor. But it stood. And then, with a determination that seemed impossible for something so small, so recently close to death, it took a step. Then another. Then another. The mother grizzly watched her baby walk across the cabin floor with an expression I can only describe as pride. She made that deep, rumbling sound again, that sound of comfort and encouragement, and the cub responded by stumbling toward her, collapsing against her chest, and immediately trying to nurse. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in weeks, and the sound surprised even me. But watching that tiny survivor, that miracle wrapped in fur and bandages, demand its breakfast with such fierce determination, how could I not laugh? The mother looked at me then, really looked at me, and I swear on everything I hold sacred, she nodded. Just once, a small dip of her massive head. Thank you. The helicopter came on the 5th day. The smoke had finally cleared enough for the relief crew to fly in with supplies, medical equipment, and a wildlife veterinarian who couldn't believe what he was seeing when he walked through the door. "That's a grizzly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's a wild grizzly bear in your living room." "Yes," I said, "and she needs your help." The vet examined both bears thoroughly. Shadow had 2nd-degree burns on her paws and some minor smoke damage to her lungs, but she was recovering well. The cub, whom I had started calling Phoenix in my mind, was in remarkably good condition considering what it had survived. "This cub should be dead," the vet said, shaking his head in disbelief. "The burns, the smoke inhalation, the trauma? I've never seen anything like this." "Its mother carried it here," I said quietly. She chose to trust a human. The vet looked at Shadow, who had risen to her feet and was watching us with those intelligent, wary eyes. In 30 years of wildlife medicine, he said, I've never heard of a grizzly doing anything like that. We released them 2 days later. The fires had finally been contained, and the Eastern Valley, Shadow's original territory, had been spared the worst of the destruction. There was still good habitat there, still abundant food to prepare for winter, still a chance for a mother and her cub to survive. We drove them in a specialized transport vehicle to a spot near where I had first seen Shadow 3 weeks earlier, before the world caught fire. The cub was fully mobile now, its paws healed enough to walk without bandages, though the scars would remain forever. When we opened the transport cage, Shadow didn't run. She stepped out slowly, the cub following close behind. She sniffed the air, testing the wind, reading the landscape in ways I would never understand. The forest around us was damaged but alive, already showing signs of recovery. Green shoots pushing through blackened soil, birds returning to the surviving trees. Life, refusing to surrender. Shadow turned to look at me. We stood there for a long moment, the grizzly and the ranger, separated by a distance that felt both vast and impossibly small. I wanted to say something, but what words could possibly be enough? Take care of your baby, I finally managed. And thank you for trusting me. She held my gaze for another heartbeat. Then she turned and walked into the forest, her cub trotting behind her, both of them disappearing into the recovering wilderness, like shadows dissolving at dawn. I returned to that station the following spring. The forest had transformed. Where there had been blackened stumps and ash, wildflowers now carpeted the hillsides. The streams ran clear again. The wildlife had returned. Elk grazing in the meadows, eagles circling overhead, the distant howl of wolves reclaiming their territory. I had thought about Shadow often during the winter. Had she survived? Had Phoenix grown strong? Had they found enough food to make it through the long months of hibernation? I had no way of knowing. Wild animals don't send postcards. On my third morning back, I stepped outside to check the weather station. There, on the top step of the cabin, was a freshly caught salmon. I froze. The fish was huge, at least 15 pounds, and it had been placed there carefully, deliberately, as if someone had wanted me to find it. There were no drag marks, no signs of scavengers. Just a perfect salmon, laid out like an offering. I looked up. At the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards away, stood a grizzly bear. Not just any grizzly, Shadow. She was healthy now, her fur thick and glossy, her body strong from a winter of rest. The burn scars were still visible on her paws, silver lines against dark fur, but they only made her more magnificent. A survivor, a fighter, a mother. And beside her stood Phoenix. The cub was huge now, nearly half its mother's size, with the awkward proportions of a yearling just starting to grow into its strength. Its own scars were visible on its muzzle, permanent reminders of the night the world burned. But it was alive. Gloriously, impossibly alive. As I watched, a smaller shape emerged from behind Shadow. Another cub. New. Tiny. Tumbling around its mother's feet with the carefree joy of an animal that had never known fire, never known fear, never known anything but the safety of its mother's protection. Shadow had started again. Life had continued. The mother grizzly looked at me across the meadow. She didn't approach. She was still wild, still cautious, still exactly what she should be. But she didn't run either. She stood there for a long moment, watching me. Then she dipped her head, just once, just like before. And then she turned, and led her family into the forest, disappearing among the trees, leaving me standing on the porch with a salmon at my feet and tears streaming down my face. I've been asked many times since then what I learned from that experience, what it taught me about nature, about survival, about the line between humans and wild animals. The answer is simple, though it took me a long time to find the words. Compassion has no species. Love knows no boundaries. And sometimes, just sometimes, the wall between us and the wild is thinner than we ever imagined. That summer, a mother grizzly chose to trust the enemy of her species because she had no other option. She gambled her cub's life on the chance that a human might choose kindness over fear. And because of that choice, hers and mine, 2 lives were saved. Now, every spring, I check my porch for salmon. And every spring, without fail, one appears. She remembers. After everything, she remembers. Please take a second to like and subscribe. Every new subscriber helps us share more incredible stories of survival, connection, and the unbreakable bond between humans and wildlife. And I want to know, have you ever witnessed an unexpected act of trust from a wild animal? Share your story in the comments. The wild is watching. Let's make sure we're worthy of that trust.